Welcome to the second module of the RBM e-learning course. We will now move from the analysis of the current situation to looking at the desired future situation where the challenges, hopefully, will have been resolved. The module will be focusing on objectives and on the changes needed to achieve the objectives. You can use this analysis that you made of the current situation to focus this work on depicting the future and formulating a theory of change. Our core tool or toolbox is the theory of change, TOC in short. The TOC will help us formulate and agree on how the desired changes can be produced. The TOC describes the pathway of changes, sometimes called a chain of results, that will lead us from the implementation of the planned activities to the production of the desired outputs, contributing to the medium and long-term effects that are the ultimate goals of our intervention. Within the theory of change, the pathway of change is a central element. It is the logic in the form of a chain of results that will lead us to the achievement of the desired objectives at outcome and impact levels. The underlying assumptions are also part of the TOC toolbox. We will look closer into assumptions in Module 3. Finally, the results framework is a matrix showing the intervention logic, the indicators of success and means of verification, as well as the assumptions. The results framework should only be established after a theory of change has been developed. In this RBM e-learning course, the results framework will be constructed gradually with input from the various modules. The learning objectives of this module are that by the end of the module, you should know what a theory of change is, how to develop a causal pathway of change, and how the theory of change can inform the results framework of your future development intervention. So, theory of change, what is it? Well, early conceptualization of the theory of change started more than 20 years ago, and it has been used in evaluations to help evaluators find out if, why, and how anticipated change resulting from project initiatives has happened. So the approach is not really new, but it is new that almost all development organizations and other organizations are using it. So the theory of change, the TOC, is an ongoing process of reflection to explore changes and how it happens. It helps us clarify our understanding of change, but it also challenges us to explore it further. The theory of change is our best guess about if we do these things, then this and that will happen. And if that happens, it will lead to X, Y, and Z. For example, if we train bus drivers to drive more safely, then there will be fewer accidents, which in turn will lead to an increased trust in and thereby use of public transportation. The outcome of the theory of change is often presented in a diagrammatic form with an accompanying narrative summary. A theory of change is thus both a process and the end product of that process. Finally, the theory of change can supplement the logical framework approach by being more flexible in adapting to changing contexts, but also the theory of change should help us to understand and report on impact and our contributions to change, and thus stimulate organizational learning. There are many versions of what the different phases of a theory of change process contain. Nevertheless, they all share the same main elements. This version is made by Maureen O'Flynn, and it is in one of the guides that is in your material. First, you have to think about and agree with the key stakeholders on how you think change might come about in the given context. Secondly, you should think about your role as an organization in the change process. How can you contribute? The third step is to imagine and formulate the desired impact of the intervention, the desired future situation where the problems identified in the problem analysis have been solved. And then you back plan from impact to outcomes and outputs by asking yourself, how can we achieve this objective? What does it take to get there? This will result in one or several effect chains, also called pathways of change. Looking at the pathway, then the fourth step identifies the underlying assumptions between the different objectives. For instance, if the logic in an effect chain goes like this, if drivers' licenses of taxi drivers are controlled regularly, then we will have better drivers and thus fewer accidents. But this logic is based on a number of assumptions. For example, that taxi drivers do have to learn how to drive and pass a test in order to get a driver's license, and that there's a correlation between the driving capacities of the taxi drivers and the number of accidents. These assumptions have to be tested before the logic can work. Fifth, once you are happy with your project plan and it has been approved, you can start implementing the project. In this phase, we would like to monitor the change or the production of results. We use indicators for this monitoring, which will be dealt with in Module 3. We also monitor assumptions. Finally, we shall also continuously monitor and reflect upon our pathway of change and see if any of the learnings shall lead to a revision of the approach. Now, when you develop a theory of change, you often do that together with other people in a workshop. So, what are the steps? First of all, remember to put an effort into selecting the right key stakeholders for the talk workshop on the basis of the stakeholder analysis. Then prepare the workshop well. Be specific about the desired outputs of the workshop, the suggested process, make a script, as well as practical and logistical matters. Thirdly, during the workshop, you shall jointly construct a causal pathway of change, where you take the desired impact, the future situation, as your point of departure, and then back plan your way to outcomes, outputs, and activities by asking yourself, what does it take to produce this change? Remember to test the underlying assumptions. We will talk more about this in the next module. It might be a good idea to leave the causal pathway for some time and come back to it and review with fresh eyes, asking questions as, are we sure that this is going to happen? And finally, the change process outlined in the talk diagram has to be described in a narrative that explains the change process in more detail. A narrative is the executive summary of the theory of change. It explains the intervention logic, the key preconditions and implicit assumptions that determine the interventions, and the expected results. Another purpose of the narrative is to be able to explain the main elements of your theory of change to others. So the narrative should be the last thing to be written when preparing a theory of change. It should be short, preferable no more than 1 page. And remember, the narrative does not replace a description of activities, of the structure of the program management, etc. These will unfold in separate sections in a project or program document. So, just to repeat, developing the causal pathway of change is the core thing in the theory of change. So, you should start out by defining the desired impact, the long-term goal, what you want to see once the project has ended. Then you plan backwards by asking yourself, what is required for this goal to be met in terms of outcomes? Who and what need to change in order to achieve those changes? And what outputs do we need to produce in order to achieve the desired outcomes? The result of this process is a logic series of changes that need to happen in order for your long-term goal to be achieved. The series of changes is what we call the causal pathway of change. Here's an example. The pathway of change should be read as follows. If we undertake training, then we will produce increased knowledge, which again will lead to more investigative media outputs, contributing to an increased critical public debate. But remember to refine and test your pathway of change. What about gender differences, for instance? If we don't work actively on including women in the training, we risk having only male journalists participating, which will lead to only male perspectives in investigative journalism and a bias of men in the critical public debate. Once you have developed your pathway of change, you have the main elements of the intervention logic. This corresponds to the first column in the results framework, which is a summary of your development intervention. As can be seen from this matrix, the first version of the intervention logic or causal pathway is developed through the theory of change exercise. Assumptions, indicators, and means of verification will be presented and inserted into the results framework at a later stage, following some of the other modules. So now it's time for you to do an exercise on theory of change. It will probably be easiest for you to continue using the same project or program that you used for the stakeholder and problem analysis. But if it makes more sense to choose another program, then feel free to do so. If a theory of change has already been developed for the program, have a critical look at it and assess whether you think it is convincing or whether you would suggest some changes. If the program has no explicit theory of change, try to formulate one using the intervention logic, this logic from activities, outputs, outcomes, impact as the backbone of your theory of change. You can use the following guiding questions for inspiration. These questions can help you investigate and perhaps improve your theory of change. Please pause the video if you want the questions to remain on the screen. When you do the theory of change exercise on your own program, feel free to note down your thoughts in a separate Word document, on a piece of paper, or any other way. But make sure that you can find it again, as you will need it for subsequent exercises. Welcome back from the exercise. Hopefully it was not too difficult to formulate or review the theory of change for your program. It is our experience that it is very useful to do so once in a while. Before we finish this module, we would like to highlight a few key points about theory of change. First of all, the theory of change is useful for testing the more or less explicit ideas we have about how change is going to happen. Our experience shows that investing time in developing and having a good dialogue around the theory of change pays off. Secondly, in order to be able to plan a solid development intervention, key stakeholders must be involved in the initial dialogue about the desired and possible changes that we are aiming at. As we have underlined earlier, stakeholder involvement is crucial to the success of a development intervention. Third, a theory of change will always be based on a certain number of assumptions that we have to test both in the planning and in the implementation phase. We will explain more about how you can work with assumptions and risks in the next module. Finally, the theory of change does not replace the logical framework approach. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of the tools are the same, but the theory of change approach can supplement the logical framework approach, helping us to focus even more on results and the changes that need to happen in order for the results to be achieved. If you are familiar with the logical framework approach, you might think that theory of change is very close to be the same. And you're perfectly right. Most of the tools are the same. But there is a difference in focus. Rather than choosing one over the other, you should rather combine the two approaches. In one of the TOC handbooks, this example of the difference between the theory of change and the logical framework approach is presented. The theory of change has the helicopter view. It looks at the big picture of change and helps you focus on actors and factors that might promote or obstruct the desired changes. The log frame has the road view, and it helps you to get safely and effectively from A to B. There's no doubt that the best results will be obtained if you combine the two approaches. On the front page of Module 1, you can find links and guides to the logical framework approach. And there's a quick introduction to the theory of change suggested to you after this session, which is now completed.